This video is not financial advice, and I have a bias towards the XX network because they are sponsors of the show. A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act, and without pangs of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority. Stanley Milgram.
We are in Gaston Hall, and I stand in front of you. Behind me is the painting of Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom, and a very good reference point for what I'm going to be talking to you about today. Our world economy is like ship in choppy waters. We need all the wisdom we can muster to steady the ship and navigate through what lies ahead.
We are in uncharted waters. The global debt is at an all-time high, and now we have disruptions in the system. In order to fight inflation, they risk the system collapsing. In order to keep the system afloat, they need to print money, making inflation worse. This is opening the eyes of the common person, and when the bottom of the pyramid realizes the pyramid was a scheme, it will no longer function.
Central banks are a relatively recent phenomenon, and they're actually going to be a short-lived phenomenon. From about 1870 to 1914, the world was on the gold standard, which is the great era of monetary stability around the world, because all the major countries were on the gold standard, which meant nobody could control the price of money. It was supply and demand, and it worked extremely well. There was no exchange fees between countries because, an ounce of gold in London was the same as New York or Tokyo or wherever. And it worked well. And the reason it fell apart is because when they went into the First World War, the countries needed to borrow a whole lot to engage in war. And under the gold standard, you limit to how much you could borrow, and which should have constrained war, but in fact, they destroyed the money engaged in war. So we look today, we have these, they call fiat currencies.
The system was born out of war. To fund the war, we needed to spend beyond our means. Now we're starting to go full circle. And maybe this isn't the end. There is still some time. However, nature has a way to balance things out. It always does. The laws of nature will balance this out. Central banks are a recent phenomenon and will actually be a short-lived phenomenon.
Do you think that, also linking it to the previous question, maybe a digital euro will actually make it more popular outside the EU borders?
Could well be, but for that, and maybe we circle back to the Atlantic Council purpose and the transatlantic relationship. And what the Council has always aimed at and for, this has to be coordinated with others. We cannot, a digital currency is borderless. It shouldn't be borderline, and it should certainly cross the line, which is why I think it should be regulated and properly supervised. But it can facilitate cross-border payments, big way, which is why between the United States authorities, the European authorities, and others beyond that, we need to compare notes. We need to check what the imperatives are. We need to understand what is the ideal supervision and regulatory mechanism so that we have something that, systems and currencies in digital form that can talk to each other, even at retail level, and certainly more so at wholesale level.
We are on a path of utilizing this technology, from the public to private sector, where value has no borders and is instant, where subjective decisions can be eliminated and the code itself can incorporate monetary stability of inflation and deflation, a computer network that balances itself for all variables. Without this small group of central bank elders making decisions that affect everyone, the code is able to calculate all variables and execute what is needed for stable money.
Important for successfully fighting inflation. Just to give you a very simple image, when the monetary policy is stepping on the brakes, fiscal policy should not step on the accelerator. Otherwise, we are for a very rough and dangerous ride.
Kristalina as well as Powell have both called out government spending. They are pointing the finger now because they already know what's at stake. The spending with high inflation is an equation, and they understand the result. Even if the government were to stop spending today, it can't stop because of entitlements in healthcare, Social Security. This equation has an answer. They're cluing you in.
You know, you got people who live on the land, you know, normal people live on the land and everything's fine. And then they decide they want to go out on the ocean, but they've never been on the ocean. So they just grab a boat and they start out there. And, you know, the ocean's a whole different ballgame. You need life preservers, you know, you need communication equipment. And, you know, if it gets foggy and you're in shipping lanes, you need radar so you don't get killed. To a large extent, the problem that we're facing as a global society is the digital world is like, it's like the ocean or something. It's a whole different thing. And everybody just decided that they'd go out there in the digital world, and they didn't really realize what they were getting themselves into. So I think David is, you know, probably the leading visionary in the sense that he said, look, this is a whole new thing. You need life preservers, you need radar, you need tools, or it's not gonna end well.
Recently it was in the news that PayPal was going to fine their users for misinformation. They later came out and said this was an error. But this is the world we live in. The XX network is a public utility that enables privacy. Some of the top cryptographers and computer scientists are involved, like David Chaum. If you're a developer that values privacy, they have a development fund to help build on top of this network.
In this decoupling scenario we are now in since the invasion, I think it's important to state that the international financial system, the IMF is part of that. The Bretton Woods institutions, as we used to know them, the G20, they are going down in significance. There is a scenario that the G20, you know, Joachim Nagel talked about that yesterday evening at a dinner, you know, is unclear what decisions will be taken in the forum of the G20, what decisions will be taken in the forum of the IMF going forward, if there are going to be several blocks and there is going to be a decoupling and a fragmentation. So in the past, we could rely on those Bretton Woods institutions. This is not likely to be the case going forward. And that has an effect on the potential rise of the renminbi. Third,
the world is becoming more fragmented. The world was globalized, and now with sanctions, there is a division between those that side with the West, those that are indifferent and want the cheapest prices, and those that were sanctioned. The Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF will have their hands tied. If an emerging markets evade sanctions, they will be secondary sanctioned and no longer allowed to get debt relief from the IMF. He is saying that China may fill this gap through their debt relief programs like the Belt and Road Initiative.
Now we are in a situation in which for emerging markets, more than a quarter of them have either defaulted or have bonds that are trading in distress territory. And what is very difficult to accept is that the picture is much worse in low-income countries. Over 60% of low-income countries are at or near that distress. What does it mean? Well, when you have numbers growing, then the risk of a debt crisis grows as well. And if it is to happen, it would not only harm people in these countries, but it would harm global growth and global financial stability.
With high interest rates, this wreaks havoc on the developing and emerging markets. All the debt that was now owed becomes more expensive. The goods they produce are less desired because we're in a global recession. Global stability. When countries default on debt, this is going to cause a shock that will ripple through the macroeconomy. The tool the IMF has is the SDR, but if nations are getting involved in politics, will they be able to bail them out? If you owe $1 billion and suddenly you get cut off from the dollar system and can't use dollars, did you just get out of that debt?
That China is the biggest lender cross-border worldwide. By the way, in US dollar. So they are they use the US dollar extensively, and there may well come a point when they choose to maybe change that to some extent. And how would that decoupling I've been talking about from China, or decoupling of China, if you want to look at that way, would that work? What would be the impact actually on their position? You know, Belt and Road is just one example going forward. And don't forget that China has underlined with everybody but with every central bank in the world but the Federal Reserve, swap lines with everybody now. And they are very strongly interconnected, which was not the case in 2015 when they entered the SDR.
Yeah.
So we need to prepare for change, would be my easy conclusion. The international monetary system is likely to become much more multipolar, as you say in your paper, in the next years, and that will cause all sorts of challenges, and the renminbi is likely to gain in structure, pretty much in line with its growing economic, geopolitical, and financial cloud, and there is more to come, I believe.
Since 2015, as China's renminbi was introduced to the SDR, they have built a massive network with its roots entangled all over the world. They have been loaning dollars mostly, but what would happen if they asked for repayment in a different currency, in gold or a digital yuan? It's popular in DC to villainize China because it wins votes. The US has escalated matters with Taiwan, for example, when Speaker Pelosi flew to Taiwan after China asked her not to. China continues to trade with Russia. Will there be a moment where the US says that they can't buy their energy anymore? Will they obey? But if that were to happen, all the debt that is owed to China could be repaid in a different currency, and this would disrupt the system.
Plugged into the global economy, that sanctioning China, certainly on a scale that we have seen with Russia, would have quite catastrophic implications.
If people began using your currency out of the knowledge that it was freely usable, right, and then it becomes less freely usable, that trade-off has to be fully internalized so that you don't. I always liken it to antibiotics. You can take antibiotics the first time and it's quite potent, but the more you take them, right, the less effective they can be over time. And I think that is a factor here in the reserve currency as well.
I'm just some idiot on YouTube. There are trillions of dollars at stake. You don't think that the smartest minds that China has to offer, or Russia or the United States, is thinking deeply about these issues? That's why there is tough talk, but it's mostly theater, because the consequences are severe. However, there is a technology that can remove these problems from the equation. And it so happens there was an executive order by the President of the United States to push these technologies.
The kind of conclusions about dollar dominance. I mean, I think that it's a very unipolar dollar world. And if you look in a span of 2 decades, it's been declining, right? And so the question is, the ones that are diversifying, right? Because there are some countries that are going to, obviously the sanctioning coalition is not going to be diversifying away. It's the countries that, think that maybe they want to be able to do some of the things that are currently being sanctioned. Those are the countries that are going to be shying away from the dollar. And do they prefer financial sanctions, or would they rather have, back to the interventionist period, where we're looking at military means in order to achieve some of these foreign policy objectives, right? I mean, that's really the counterfactual on that side as well. So not just in terms of the efficacy, but also in terms of the backlash, right?
Trustless networks are able to predefine condition. It can house all currencies, all things of value, without the risk of anyone being able to freeze the value. The world is dividing, splitting, and trustless networks offer the utility of sound medium of exchange. You've heard the term sound money, but I'm saying sound medium of exchange because there is no way someone can freeze your assets or take control of what is yours. On a national level, arrangements can be predefined without surprises, written into smart contracts where nothing besides the agreement happens. These systems are crypto assets or ledgers. Private and permission systems will not suffice because it's a small group controlling the ledger. A crypto asset is a massive group controlling a ledger, and in order for something to happen, all the nodes would have to agree.
I mean, we talked about cross-border payments, but that's just a sliver of it. I mean, are we really on the horizon of a major catalyst for future GDP growth, or is this a sideshow? Thank you.
Who would like to take that question?
I'll give way quickly to others, but just to note that the report, we didn't cover some of the benefits that are covered. So, decentralized finance and smart contracting technologies have been proposed as potentially used, in repo and insurance and major parts of the financial system. There's in the same way that Federal Reserve banknotes, gave rise to a lot of innovation that accounted for genuine productivity growth, real increases in GDP and financial sector value added, there's at least the prospect that some innovation built on top of a stable, well-regulated, safe money platform, could come about. And policymakers are rarely the ones that can best identify, what exactly that innovation might look like. The reason responsible innovation shows up so much in the executive orders, I think it is our job to lay the conditions such that our economy is protected, but the conditions are such that innovation, in fact, can take place. So I agree with your point, that there are some real plausible gains, even above and beyond cross-border payments, which I also do think is quite important.
Thank you, Brent.
The executive order pushes for responsible innovation, and cross-border payments is an easy use case. To quote Anya Manuel, if the U.S. had national champions, Ripple would be it. Blockchain converging with the Internet of Things, AI, smart factories, automation, we're going to watch the cost of products and services drop, and this translates to a better quality of life for everyone. Money is meaningless. It's the stuff you can buy with the money, and when technology enables abundance, that is a future I'm looking forward to. However, I believe there are rough times ahead while this all works itself out. But as I mentioned earlier, nature balances itself out, and nature is abundant. The disappearance of a sense of responsibility is the most far-reaching consequence of submission to authority. Stanley Milgram. Thanks everyone, I hope you enjoyed the show. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you enjoy content like this and want to help support my channel, please consider joining my Patreon.